Alright, it's another day of doing the Homeric Rhapsody thing. Again, what I'm trying to do here is uphold the ancient tradition of oral poetry, which is to say, not necessarily reciting a story like in its entirety word for word like an actor would do on stage, not necessarily trying to invent my own thing, but rather telling a story comprised of the chunks that you remember and stitched together by the pieces that you can think of on the spot in order to make the pieces fit. And also just telling it in the way that occurs to you on that day. So if I were to tell the same story 5 days in a row, it would be 5 different stories as we define stories in the modern era. But at that time, that would all be the same story. It's kind of hard to wrap your head around it as a person living now, but that's how it was done. And that's how Homer did it, and that's how I'm trying to do here in order to better kind of get better accustomed to the sort of Homeric verse rolling off the tongue for the game project that I'm working on. So let's keep doing it. Pitched in combat were those two great warriors, Paris, Prince of Troy, brother of the shining-helmed Hector, and Menelaus, the son of Atreus, king of Sparta, the man who was wronged and his one who wronged him, both fighting on the plains of Troy before both assembled armies. Words reached back all the way from the front, through criers and through other onlookers, on the status of what was happening. Not a man could take his eyes from the fight who was able to see, and those who were not waited without any patience breathlessly for the results to hear what was happening. Paris and Menelaus had both cast their spears. Paris had a slight chunk taken from his side as the spear cut through his corselet, and both had now drawn their dark bronze blades from their sheaths at their fronts, and Menelaus was charging like one possessed, like a lion who comes on the flocks, as a lion jumping over the herdsman's fence, and without any regard for his own life, starts thrashing the sheep and the cattle and whatever he can lay his teeth on in order to slake his deathly hunger. When something is hungry as that, it matters not what he feasts on, and Menelaus had such a hunger to kill the man who had done in the great and honored tradition of guest friendship. Menelaus it was who struck first, and Paris had only just glancingly blocked the blow. But if he had not, it would have surely riven him from shoulder all the way down to his hip bone, and his torso would have been cleft in two, hanging across and touching the ground. Paris returned his blow, but not with enough force. It merely bounced from the shield of Menelaus. And thus were the two fighters fighting. Paris, it seemed, either not with his heart in the combat, or not with enough strength at hand-to-hand fighting as he was with the bow and with other long-range weapons. After a while, Menelaus had battered Paris into submission. He had lost his shield, lost his sword, Paris had, and Menelaus was about to deal the cruel death blow when it occurred to him that he could perhaps draw it out for a bit. Menelaus began giving a speech on the wrongness of what Paris had done. Do you see, men of Troy, what you have followed into this battle and into this war? Do you see, great and hearty Achaeans, What has brought you out to these shores so far from your homes? Not a man, a worthless worm down on the ground, not fit to lick the boots of any of you assembled here. This is the man who will pay for the crimes that Troy and Achaia have been paying for these 9 long years. And now, great son of crooked Kronos, imbue my blade with that death-dealing blow, and let him take a quick death, though we all know he does not deserve it. Thus Menelaus struck and clashed his bronze blade on the helmet rim of Paris, a fatal blow no matter who would deal it. But some god, Aphrodite perhaps, had been protecting that man, that blessed man Paris. The sword made of pure bronze, shiny and polished and hard enough to cut through the greatest and hardiest of warriors, shattered on impact. As it reached that helmet crest, the sword broke into many pieces, falling onto the ground, some striking the shining breastplate of Menelaus, some flying into the crowd, and Menelaus was left with but a hilt. He quickly had words to say directly above to heaven. "Oh, great lightning lord, is this how you repay someone's wrong to guest friendship, that great custom which you yourself are patron god of? Is this the way the gods revere me, that they hold me in the lowest of esteem among all men who walk and crawl upon the earth, eating Demeter's grain? I will take this man's life if it means wrenching it from him with my bare fists." And thus Menelaus cast the sword aside, the useless shaft, and he grabbed Paris by the helmet crest, that great horsehair plume shining and billowing out. Menelaus grabbed him by that crest and began dragging him back toward the ranks. And just as Paris was about to choke out his life, the strap of the helmet cutting into his upper chin area, the strap miraculously broke off, and the helmet went flying, Menelaus falling to the ground with the force and inertia of having held that helmet crest so tightly. This was not the last intervention that would occur from a god or goddess, for as no one could see but Paris himself, a cloud was brought around him, and no one was able to see where Paris had went. A large dust cloud had surrounded him, and within that cloud Paris saw the great goddess Aphrodite, who had seen but once before, so many years ago. She grabbed him and took him as swift as thought, as swift as a man would think to himself who had been on many travels, "I wish I were there," or "I wish I were here." She grabbed him and cast him all the way back into that great city of Troy, through the window into his chambers. None of the other army, the Trojans or the Achaeans, were the wiser. They all thought Paris still in that spot, ready and vulnerable to be able to be taken down by Menelaus. Thus was Paris returned to his chambers. That great man Priam, who stood on the ramparts, was wondering what would become of this battle. Only a little while earlier he had come down, made sacrifice to the great gods, and made promises to the Achaeans about the prizes and the reparations he would give if Paris were to lose. And surely it seems now that he is to lose. Helen, sitting by his side, who couldn't bear to watch the action, had been looking askance, and all the old men who stood and gave counsel around Troy were staring with furtive glances, staring at the battlefield, but every so often giving glances toward Helen, with their withered frames still in their minds, feeling the same lust that any man who looked upon her would feel. Helen stared at that battlefield and couldn't bear to look at the action, though somewhere in her thought she began to wonder if not she would prefer that Paris be taken and that her city once again become that of fertile Sparta, where she had grown up and spent so many of her days. Thus was the battle between Menelaus and Paris decided, though not yet to the knowledge of those on the battlefield. All right. So an interesting situation happened here where so the battle scene was interestingly handled. It was a little bit more, Homer doesn't necessarily do like a back and forth blow for blow type of description, which I started to realize I was like reverting into and then tried to sort of course correct there. It wasn't bad, but it didn't feel Homeric to me. I gave Menelaus one extra speech in the middle, but the most significant thing about this one was that in the middle, once Paris got back to the city, I realized that I had left out a huge portion of book 3, which is a lot of different pieces. And I had kind of skipped over it pretty, like, in an elegant way, where, like, you know, when I came back the next day, they were getting ready to assemble on the battlefield, and they did assemble. And that's when all of these other moments that I skipped would have happened, where Priam is sitting on the wall and Helen comes up there and he asks her to describe all the different guys from the armies, and she kind of laments how much of a evil influence on Troy she's been, and there's all of these really kind of like poignant story moments that happen that I completely forgot to add. I just totally missed those. And so then Paris got back to the city, and I kind of like reinserted at least some of the things that I could find excuses to put back in, where like Priam was up there and giving like a, backward looking thing about how he had assembled on the wall, and adding the thing about how the old men of the city, or, the counselors and stuff, were like appreciating Helen's beauty, and all this stuff that would have happened back then, but that now has to happen here. Which, if you read the Iliad, there is a lot of stuff that, if you're thinking about it in this oral poetry way, which is how most people think it was really composed nowadays. 100 years ago, people thought that it was composed by sitting down and writing, like any author now would do, or like Virgil did. But people mostly think now that it was done in oral poetry. And if you do read it with that kind of like mindset, it really does. There are a lot of parts where Homer seems to go back and then explain a thing that it feels like he forgot to say before, and that he's now just like, let me, add in this part that I had kind of like left out. Not in an inelegant way, but you're trying to incorporate it back into the story and find an excuse to put it there. And some of them are a little more elegant than others, depending on which parts you're thinking of. One of my favorites is in, I think, book 10, which most people don't even think is written by Homer, but it's one of my favorite little moments where he like makes this weird argument about why mules are better at pulling oxen or better at pulling like a plow than oxen are. It, like, in the middle of a totally different thing about like a chase between Odysseus and Diomedes and Dolon. But we'll get to that part eventually. But what I'm trying to say is that it was an interesting moment where I clearly had forgotten a huge portion of the story to add in. And if I were giving this performance in front of, you know, an audience, the important thing is just that I have that part in the story somehow. So I kind of like reincorporated it, even though it had been skipped in its place where it would usually fit. And I did it in a not so bad way. You know, it wasn't the best, but it was an interesting moment where I had to think on my feet compositionally and found a way to put it back in. So that was a nice little sort of like realization there, I guess. And yeah, you know, every day doing it and seeing if I can come up with stuff. It's funny because I'm already, you know, kind of feeling like I'm getting a lot of insight into this stuff. Like I was just saying how, you know, that part gives me kind of an idea of kind of like better understanding Homer. And for anybody who's played my other projects, I had made a game called Young Homer where it's like a fictional version where he tried to write the Odyssey first. And so, you know, at a certain point in the game, he decides like, actually, I'll try writing something else, and he writes the Iliad instead. But the idea of that game is that it's like a collectible card game, and you're like collecting little story beats as each card and trying to like upgrade them and assemble them, and then go every night to tell your story orally. And I've, you know, always wanted to make like a bigger version of that because I just made it for a game jam. Like I made it in 10 days. And, you know, doing this also has been giving me a lot of good ideas for that game. So I have a big document where I'm keeping notes and stuff about that. But yeah, it's weirdly like, you would think you would have to be like a scholar or go out to Yugoslavia or whatever, former Yugoslavia, and like, you know, study this stuff. Like that's how everybody's done it. But I'm actually gaining a lot of insight just trying to do it myself, which is it's kind of like surprising revelation there. But all right, yeah, you know, again, not very good at it yet, but at least I feel like I'm learning and getting a little better each time. So let's keep going.